So I have picked up a context that is deliberately very, very simple. Okay, there are much more complicated papers on trade for India and for other countries, but I'm going to talk about topical as it used to be about 10 years back, but also helps us understand how to go about arguing things. Okay, so simple, is trade liberalization good for productivity? So let me tell you one classic problem that most people have which don't do very detailed analysis is when you measure average productivity of industries, when you liberalize particular industries, liberalize as in import quotas, get rid of import quotas, lower tariffs, things like that. Often you observe large changes in productivity, right, of industries. And the biggest concern when you do that is that sometimes, so what do you want? You want, as a policy maker, you don't want industries to be more efficient, right? You want firms to be more efficient. You want to say that there are, a firm is working, there are some, it's got an input bundle, it's got, it's trying to produce something, and is it true that when you liberalize or you allow firms to come in from outside or you allow more exports, is it true that the firm becomes more productive because of various pressures? So some of the lecture notes which are there with you, because I have in the first lecture, actually goes into some of these reasons why when you liberalize you may find these various effects. But one effect which is really, really problematic when you work with sectoral data or industry level data is that the increase in average productivity of industries need not imply that firms become more productive. Can you think why? So you want firms to be more productive, and you find that industries at the sectoral level look more productive, but the first one, the fact that, or the second one, the fact that industries are more productive does not imply that firms are more productive. Let's say that yeah, any average is affected by outliers. That's true. But let's say there's no outliers. So you basically measure. So you can check that. You measure basically the sectoral productivity or industry productivity before like 1987 in India. You measure it in 95. You can check then whether there are outliers at that time and stuff, and then you check it in 95, 96, right? And you find that at the sectoral level, productivity of industry is higher in 96, 97 or 95. Then you say, well, trade liberalization has been very good because now firms are more productive. Can you think of a situation where this would be a wrong inference?
They have put some more money into their firms.
Mm-hmm.
Meet the demands in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not productive in the first year, second year. Maybe productive in the
96, चलो 91 में हुआ था ना 96. Give it years. It's not. I mean, one is to say that firms will make investments initially. They will learn something, and then they will be more productive. Let's say that they have learned. Let's give it 5-7 years. 7 years में नहीं होगा तो कभी नहीं होगा. Any other reason? One of the biggest effects of any kind of policy is essentially that it causes entry and exit, especially exit, right? So what do you expect? You expect that the firms that are not productive will just leave the industry. Then what will happen? The set of firms that will be left in the market are firms which were productive to begin with. Now they themselves may not even show any productivity increase, but the average will show now a big rise, right? Just because now the average is only averaged over all the productive firms, right? So this selection effect in fact happens almost all over the world. In fact, the initial great, this thing that liberalization is going to change the world, in South America people found these big results and everyone was very happy, we should do it all over the world. And then when they started doing more disaggregated analysis at the firm level, they realized that a large part of these large productivity gains were in fact that you're basically shutting down all inefficient firms. Now this could be an aim, but it makes it little less saleable, right? If the only purpose of a policy is to shut down people who are not efficient, that's not really persuasive argument for actually having liberalization. Okay, which is why there's a big kind of emphasis that any time you look at policy impacts, you should look at individual units and not at the aggregate. And if you look at the aggregate, then you have to think about what is happening, who's been selected, who's going out, who's exiting, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now you can see that this is less of a concern in when you work on development of villages or things like that. Though it could be in some sense, if you think about migration, you can often have situations where I have something I did long time back, which is about a village called Palanpur, which is actually in UP near Moradabad, and basically we were looking at whether people go out of the village, in terms of work and commuting, and basically we found that over time Palanpur had lesser, proportion of people commuting just fell, right? And that was completely contrary to what we'd expect. We expect firms to, villages to get more integrated to international markets or domestic markets. Moradabad is close by, it's booming, so on and so forth. But then we realized that it's basically because anyone who was working to begin with just left the village, right? Then the village basically became a group of people who were anyways not inclined to go out and work. So then it looked like it was so then you felt that, that the impact of liberalization was, or whatever, construction industry growth was that people go out less. So they must be happier. So you can construct a lot of theories. They must be happier, there must be migration, income, this, that. It's just selection, that the people left behind are very different from people who were earlier living in the village. Similarly, for every aggregate across streams, whenever you look at the aggregate, you have to look at the composition of units that make up that aggregate, because that selection can play a very important role. Okay, so for sure this is a big thing when you look at any macro kind of study which has industries, sectors, so on and so forth. So so the work generally which is kind of accepted more is largely to do with firms, and there are many ways you can do it. So just to kind of give you a very brief kind of view, there are some papers which look at these trade liberalization and firm performance. Actually, these are the ones that people cite. In fact, there are many more. So the ones which people cite, I think they cite because largely they understand what is going on. When you look at a paper and don't understand what's going on, people don't cite it even though it's right. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit in detail on a paper by Topolova and Khandelwal. Some of you maybe have even seen this paper before. But the idea is to look at the argument, the way the argument is constructed. Okay, and you can always have, you should point out what you think are the problems with the kind of arguments. Don't take this as gospel truth. So you should point out what you think is wrong. Okay, and I encourage that. Okay, so they exploit 1991 liberalization episode to examine the effects of trade reforms on firm productivity. Okay. Of course, we are Indians, so of course we want to know what happens, but one thing about being more general interest is to basically look for why India is the right place to study many of these issues. Okay, especially if you are coveting a publication in an international fora. Often saying ki India hai, I'm interested in India is not going to sell. People want to know whether this has any general applicability in outside. So one of the things that is that you will see, and that people kind of contend, is that the reforms are not endogenous to productivity, and we'll discuss this point in a bit. In other words, it's not the case that reforms are phased in as domestic firms improve productivity. Okay, you can imagine that firms are already on the path to productivity. Suddenly there are reforms in 91, but वो तो ऐसे भी हो रहा था पहले. So you think that it's because of productivity, right? Something is going up, there is some event that happens, and then you ascribe the going up to that event. That's not right. So but this is just a contention, okay? And this is going to be using panel data, and I'll talk a little bit about prowess and ASI. Okay, so just to give like the briefest summary of this, There are, people have almost got Nobel Prizes for saying, for more research on these things. 1947 to 80s, India's trade regime is restrictive. Anyone who did economic history or Indian economy course knows this. 1980s onwards, India embarked on market reforms to ease import and industrial licenses. Trade reforms were still restrictive. Late 80s, we all know there was a macroeconomic imbalance, structural adjustment program. Then there's a lowering of tariff, easing on quantitative controls. The first thing that you require to write a paper on a causal paper, the first thing in the sense that the first thing that would be really great is this particular statement that average tariffs fell from more than 87% to 43% in 1996. Okay? Big jumps. Problem is when you study economies, there is always a kind of a trend on everything, right? Things fall, things rise. If you are trying to use time series data to look at variation over time, right? Typically what people will ask you to do is to basically put a trend term to detrend the data, right? Anything that is going very gently in a particular pace, if you put a trend term, the variation will disappear. Once you partial out the impact of time, there will be nothing left. Okay? So what one good thing is, you should always look for jumps. So this average tariff thing is a big jump. Okay? But of course you have to think about what is happening before. Relative to that, definitely it's a big jump. Standard deviation of tariffs dropped by about 30%. The share of products subject to quantitative restriction decreased from 87% to 45%, right? So the first requirement typically is that there is a big effect. Okay? This is not always so when you actually do policies, because policies take, in contrast to tariff rates, policies often take some time to kind of get into, So for example, NREGA, NREGA starts in 2005, staggers across districts, initial allocations are big, but they're not reaching people's pockets. If you start looking at analysis around that time, you will see that even though it looks big, but in effect, it doesn't make any difference. Okay? So you have to kind of choose the right time frame. A part of understanding and getting results is to choose the right time when you think the policy is at its best, like where you think that it's going to work in its fullest. Okay? You have to give yourself the biggest advantage. Remember, once you put up a paper, people are going to try to hack you down. So you don't choose a paper where you think that policy is not fully blown. So this is a big policy change. Okay? And so then the second thing is, do you see some change in behavior? Forget about the fact that it's causal or not. Okay? First thing is, you see imports increased, particularly among intermediate imports. Trade to GDP ratio increased on average in 13% to 19%. I point out this is a more general point, and sometimes this is a point that people miss, especially in the beginning of their careers. If you don't have a descriptive table where your outcome variable changes in a substantive way because of whatever you're trying to study, okay, you are going to find very hard to convince people that after all the kind of technical things and all that, suddenly you find an effect. Okay? This is a no go. If you don't get, unless there are strong priors that the biases run in the opposite direction, it must always be the case that the descriptive shows you a big impact, right? And then once you start controlling for things, you start taking care of technical problems, it kind of chisels away, and in the end you hope that some part of it remains, right? And that's basically how empirical work works. When people ask me, what should I look for when I'm trying to write a paper, my first question is, forget about all these complicated things. Pehle just see if you actually see that in the data or not. Just draw descriptives, make a table, draw a graph, right? If you don't see it there, you're not going to see it later. वो कभी कोई आ जाता है, पर वो convince करना बहुत मुश्किल होता है. People just don't buy it. Yes. No, it's tragic for you, but but you learn something. Yeah. So, the thing is that, there is an obsession about methods, whether I don't know it's good or bad, but over time people have begun, everyone now knows these tricks, right? When it first started, OLS regression run karna it was a tough thing. People were in the 80s, putting punch cards to do OLS regression. So anyone did in 80s and 90s, people did OLS regressions. Whatever result came, they said, "It OLS hai," like you're like Bhagwan hai types. That era is, then all these more complicated, this, that, clustering karenge, ye karenge, wo karenge. The fact is that it is not going to bite. You will see that the beauty of why randomized control trial papers publish so high, apart from the randomization, is the fact that results are so stark. So you may not completely believe them ki generalizable hai ki nahi hai, but you can see that effect, right? And then you have to come up with a really convincing story that why this is not true, right? So that initial impression really matters. So I would urge that. So you will see all good papers, introduction, they are going to say that this is a large impact, it's got a large impact on the descriptives. This impact does not go away once you start doing all kinds of things. That's the way you should think about it. So anyone who does not have an overall result, but then in table 4, once they control for something, suddenly result comes in, unless you have a very convincing reason why that bias was opposite to begin with, you should not expect any particular thing. Fact that results are so stark. So you may not completely believe them ki generalizable hai ki nahi hai, but you can see that effect, right? And then you have to come up with a really convincing story that why this is not true, right? So that initial impression really matters. So I would urge that. So you will see all good papers, introduction, they are going to say that this is a large impact, it's got a large impact on the descriptives. This impact does not go away once you start doing all kinds of things. That's the way you should think about it. So anyone who does not have an overall result, but then in table 4, once they control for something, suddenly result comes in, unless you have a very convincing reason why that bias was opposite to begin with, you should not expect any particular thing. So as we did in the morning, one of the main things is to do any kind of work is variation. Most of econometrics statistical work is just variation. There's not, if you understand variation, that you're 50% there. Okay. So there are various kinds of variations. So one is like you can have dummy variables, like this one has dummy variable to indicate whether the period pehle 91 ke pehle 91 ke baad. Okay. So whenever you have dummy variables, you will have less variation. Whenever you have more disaggregated data, so now tariff rates will differ at 6-digit level for various things. Okay. So it's recommended that you try to get as much variation as you can, but now as soon as you get more variation, people start asking these commonsensical questions that why do you have variation, right? So it's true, you can say that look, India's liberalization thing has nothing to do with firms. Ye to, this was a decision made because we were having some problem with balance of payments and we did it. Okay. It's nothing to do with how each firm was, how productive it was or not. That is still an argument. Now when you move to individual 6-digit level variation in tariff rates, that's not so obvious that the variation across tariff rates is not affected by industries, right? Industries are lobbying all the time to get things in their thing. So the natural question is that the change in tariffs for an industry, which you are using in this paper as variation, is that a function of its past performance of industries, right? Are you observing, are you basically observing, so I will make this argument later, but just to, for example, is it true that inefficient firms have very small tariff changes, right? They don't progress much. Efficient firms, they are saying, okay, bring it on, tariff change, बढ़ा दो, कोई problem नहीं है, and you see big productivity changes in them. Then you find that जहाँ tariff ज़्यादा बढ़ता है, productivity goes up, right? So there are many arguments which can be vacuous, and we'll come to it in a bit. Okay, now the morning session, construction of firm level TFP, Levinson Petrin. Okay, there is pretty much no other option. just LPM. Okay, so it's easy to do, but now you know that it can be done, okay, in certain ways. To control for productivity. So why do you do it? Now there are two reasons, as we talked in the morning. We said, well, to the simultaneity of input choice, which depends on productivity. That's good motivation. But you know, in the prowess data set, one of the problems is that, as I said, that it's limited to large firms. So exit of firms, which is a big issue in LP, is not really an issue, right? So I think Ajay is coming to give you a lecture later on. Ajay Shah, he's made this point many times, that you know, we are doing LP, OP. Should we really need to do it? Because you know, how big is this simultaneity problem? You know, because the other big problem this is trying to address is the problem of exit, which is big when you observe data on various kinds of firms. But if your data set is already big firms which hardly exit, then is it worth it? Okay. So what is the impact of too few firms at higher level of disaggregation? What will happen if there are too few firms at each? Like, remember, tariffs at the 6-digit level. So if you have firms at the 6-digit level, what is the consequence if you do any estimation? Or it will be very high standard errors, as I said. So everything will look like, you know, it can be 0 also. So what level you work at, often you can aggregate up to where you have more. So if you have units, you can. So if you're working, if you find that there are too few households, if you look the NSS, you find too few households at the district level when you're running a regression. The reason why you move to a state region or a higher level is not because they are not representative. This idea that things in a regression, representativeness is a less important thing, because you are not trying to give people averages. You are trying to give people associations between variables. Okay? So the reason why people want to move to a higher level when they want to run regressions is basically that they want to have larger number of units. Larger number of units gives more precision. That means what you can say, it will be close to the population number, right? At the lower level. So by the way, like the NSS is consistent at the district level. The way stratification is done, it's an unbiased, consistent estimator of district means. But what does that mean, being consistent? It means that if n tends to, मतलब मेरे पास पूरा data set होता n तक, तो वो population number होता. I mean, but मेरे पास नहीं है. I have 50 households, right? So what's the point? So it's equally important to have precise estimates. Okay. Okay. Capital stock for each period generated by perpetual inventory model. So this is one of these. So this I want to point out. I wrote this because I once did it for one of my papers, and I was very, very uncomfortable doing this, which is that when you don't have stock or data, often people will construct stock data by looking at the flow data. So you don't have capital stock, you take investment and you add investment over time if you have temporal data, and then you create stock. Okay. Now this method works in some literature, does not work in other literature. So if you take investments by households and then call it wealth, it may not work in development economics. On the other hand, if you take stocks of investments by firms and call it capital stock, it works because that's what they do. Okay. So sometimes it's not a matter of common sense only, it's what works in each literature. Okay. And it's true that at some point some people have tried to validate this and show that it's not a big assumption in the industrial, when you're looking at industries and firms. So there is no one method. So don't get dissuaded that यहाँ पे काम नहीं करता तो वहाँ पे काम नहीं करता है, and don't assume that in some places if it works, if it doesn't work. I was talking about using with one of you using the LP estimation techniques for understanding human capital. It's fine, you can bring new ideas, people have not heard about these things, right? But on the other hand, just remember that what you take as standard, like I have said, construction of firm LP, no questions will be asked because this is standard in this literature. You take an LP and put it into a development problem like household problem, people will want to know 50 details of it because they have not done LP. They want to know what you have done exactly, right? And in the details they may not like the details and say ki nahi, we don't accept it. Okay. So as I said, what do? We obtain input coefficients, subtract the predicted value of actual values to get residuals, which is exactly what we did in the morning. Of course industries vary, so you need to do some standardization, and it's not a rocket science. You create a productivity index by subtracting it from some reference firm, productivity in a particular industry in a particular year. So you kind of give it a base. This IT industry, this firm is our base, and we are going to look at the progress of IT firms. There is no IT here, but IT firms relative to that particular firm, because different industries can have different base levels of productivity. Very simple, कुछ नहीं है. This is basically productivity of the ith firm in the jth industry at time t, okay, and there are a bunch of variables x. There is trade, which is basically the lag tariff rate at the 4-digit NIC level, and and there's some error term, okay. Why do we have alpha t? What's the point of having alpha t? What are we doing with alpha t? Huh? Alpha t basically allows for different intercept term in every period. So I can write this as alpha times dummy for every period. So what does it do? Yeah, but it's controlling for the time trend, but not in a continuous function, but actually it's allowing every year to have a different mean, right? Because it's allowing every year to have a different dummy coefficient. Okay, what about alpha j? Right? It's an industry thing. Now the question is it important for this particular thing? Is it important for the productivity measure? Is this variable important for the productivity measure? This alpha j? So remember, what it will do is they will allow different productivities, right, for each industry. How important is that given what we have done already? What have we done already? Remember, how do we calculate productivity? You've done it already, no? So productivity type, agar industry type का कोई effect है, it's already taken care of already by standardization. Then what's the role of this alpha j here? So think about again the kind of setup I said in the morning. So think about, so there are two things happening. I mean, forget about everything else. Let's say this is just the dummies. Okay. So the coefficients here are, first you're running the productivity on each of the dummies for the industry, right, and taking residuals, which is fine. You can do that. But it's doing something more, right? It's taking the trade, the tariff rates, right, regressing it on the industry dummies, and then taking the residual. Right? Forget about this x, forget about alpha t, everything, right? So just think that those two variables, cast, ye hai cast, ye hai schooling, right? So what are you doing? You're removing the effect of industries from productivity, right? But that is not a big deal, because that, so anyway you are already standardized. The next thing it's doing is, it's basically taking the trade and removing the impact of each industry. So then what does that do? So I'm asking, JT equal to, let's forget everything else. So alpha j means, it's one way of writing alpha j is right. Right, because these alpha j's are just dummies in front of. So industry 1 has alpha 1, industry 2 has alpha 2. So क्या कर रहा है? What is the variation that is being used? Remember what the method was? You run this regression, you get these coefficients, then it's equivalent to That's a residual. So what is that residual? Means, right? When you run a regression on dummies, so each of these coefficients is the average tariff rate, right? It is the tariff rate for each industry J. Okay. So basically what you are doing is you are taking the tariff rates of the industry J at time t and subtracting from it the average tariff rate for that industry over the years. Okay. So basically what you are seeing is you are seeing every period where how much it is more or less relative to its own mean. So if you take industry 1, right, industry 1 ka data will be like, so there are the years, say 1987, 88, let's say 1996. Okay. Then there are, you know, tariff rates, this trade for 1987, trade tariffs for 1996. Okay. What's the mean? You add them up and divide by number of years. Okay. What's this term here? This is trade 87 minus the average tariff rate for this industry, right. So it's minus trade for this industry. Right. It's the deviation every year from the average tariff rate for that industry. Okay. So that is the source of variation. Okay. So that is important to understand, because you should in fact even look at it, right. If you do it, if you were to calculate this residual, what do you get? Is there enough variation, right? And if there isn't, then you will not get a result. So often I notice that people, you know, or students always rush to me saying, "Sir, nikal gaya, insignificant ho gaya," you know, after all this stuff. I always tell them to look, see your variation, where does it come from? That's the source. Don't think about, so if you show me tariff rates J T minus 1 and show me the data for it and it's all variation hai, that's not relevant, because that variation is not being used for your estimation. The only variation that matters for your paper is that variation, right? And if that variation is you know, very low, then that's why you're getting insignificant results. Okay. So sometimes you don't have solutions, but you should know the problem, because you cannot figure out solutions if you don't know the problem. So the thing I hate is when you start putting in more variables. That's usually our first thing. You keep putting variables, kabhi na kabhi significant aa jayega, right? That is not a way. You keep trying, because I have noticed over time that doesn't work very much, because you may have 10 variables and then the referee will tell you कि मुझे 10 के 5 लेके दिखाओ, या उसमें 5 और add करो, right? And then the result disappears. Okay. So it's very important to understand the source of your variation. Okay. So of course there are more things now. So time, you know, you're also removing the impact of time, so it's actually minus even more. Then you're removing the impact of all the x's. So in fact, in the end, you have very little variation. So one of the anytime you have papers like this, when you are using these continuous kind of changes in something, one residual you should always look at is run this on the specification. Okay. So trade JT minus 1 on alpha plus alpha t, or whatever, alpha plus alpha t plus alpha j plus x prime gamma, calculate residuals and plot the residuals. Okay. If you don't see variance in that, then you don't have a paper. Okay. It's very important that you see that. Okay. Now, once you use some techniques, there are some, you know, you have to follow it to kind of to the next logical steps. Okay. So now think about the LP or the OP or whichever, consistency with LP. So recall that when we used the LP, or we did the OP for the class, one of the main things was productivity is linked to previous productivity, right? We made a big use of this lagged variable कि उसका पिछले साल का देख लेंगे and stuff like that. Now, once you do that, then we have assumed already that productivity follows a Markov process. So it must be a function of previous period productivity as well, right? If we are to be consistent with LP, you cannot be using the lag in one step and then saying कि अब भूल जाओ, अब मेरा LP आ गया है, so I will not use it. Okay. Therefore, we have to include a lag dependent variable TFP as a regressor in the fixed effects regression. So, before I show you the answer, do you know what happened? So, basically, like you have time, but you have a lag dependent variable. What happens? So, if you have YT, why? Why not? Why will it not be equal to 0? So, here is the question. Here is YT equal to alpha plus beta YT minus 1 plus epsilon t. There are other variables, but let us just forget them for now. Why is beta not correct? So, obviously, the right thing is you have to think about what is the covariance between YT minus 1 and epsilon t. ये तो मतलब आँख बंद करके लिख दो, right? And now the question is ये 0 है कि नहीं? So, let us think what YT minus 1 is. So, YT minus 1 is alpha plus beta YT minus 2 plus epsilon t minus 1. So, is a function of YT minus 2 is a function of epsilon t. Why not? There is no reason to. If it is 0, then you have no problem. But if it is not 0, then you have a problem. There is nothing, I mean, we do all cross sectional work, we do a lot of work assuming that there is no serial correlation, right? But in this respect, if there is any serial correlation, if these terms are correlated, if, then immediately you can see that this one enters here, so you will get this will not be equal to 0. Okay? So, in an OLS, a lag dependent variable is a problem only if there is serial correlation. If there is no serial correlation, there is no problem. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this logic does not go through when you look at panel data. So, panel data में कोई अच्छा चीज़ भी है, कोई गड़बड़ की चीज़ भी है. Okay? So, here is a simple example. So, consider the ith firm. Let us refer to periods 0, 1 and 2 in the subscripts. So, 3 periods, right. So, 3 periods because of course दो period है तो एक चाहिए lag लगाने के लिए. Here is the first period. It depends on productivity of the previous period, like LP. The second period depends on the productivity of the first period, again by LP. Fixed effects matlab you are doing those differences we did earlier. So, you take the difference between omega 2 minus omega 1. So, you get beta times omega 1 minus omega 0 plus that. Now, you can see that EI1, right, and omega I1, ये तो by construction ही correlated है, right. So, कुछ you don't require any assumptions about serial correlation or anything. In a panel data setup for fixed effects, if you have a lag dependent variable, you are immediately what you have is a problem. Right? You just cannot run it. उसमें कोई assumption की ज़रूरत नहीं है. You just cannot run it. Okay. So, by construction, these are correlated. So, omega 1 minus omega 0 is correlated to EI2 minus EI1. This will give us inconsistent results. Okay. So, whenever you have systems which have these lag dependent variables, the way out is to treat it like a system. I am not going to talk much about it. These are called Arellano bond estimators. So, I will give you the intuition. The intuition is basically they use lags, previous lags, right. So, those who know this, it is very simple. You just basically take things which are further lags of variables. Those lags are not correlated with E2 minus E1. Okay. So, it is a way of instrumentation where the variation comes from the past. It is a sasta way because you do not need more data. So, everyone loves it. Okay. But you have to do that. You cannot just run a fixed effects regression with just putting a variable in like that and not do this particular thing. Okay. Then there are issues of basically how you define variables in regression. Okay. Sometimes they are useful, sometimes they do you harm, but I mean referees usually ask for both. So if you have various methods to measure the same thing, you can be sure that even if you don't present in your paper, some referee is going to suggest that you show it. Okay. So it's a good idea to be prepared. Okay. And sometimes you don't always have to report the results. At least you can just put in a footnote saying our results go through, even if we define it differently. Okay. And this is important. Earlier I used to always think that I would just leave it. मैं tank में रख दूंगा मैं कि ये मांगेगा तो immediately I will give that result because I know it works. In the long run, I see it does not work that way. They always suggest something that I have never thought of. So, but anyway, try and put in footnotes so that they actually, in fact, don't ask you to do that again. In trade, especially, you have, you can use tariff rates, both tariff rates for exports and imports. But trade comes with a lot of theory, which I'm not covering, which I covered in the first lecture. So those who have done some trade, you know that you can get different effects from output tariffs and input tariffs. In fact, it's not very clear which way tariffs should affect firms. So of course, output tariffs, when they fall, you can, if input tariffs fall, if output tariffs fall, then you can basically others competing with you. So that puts some pressure on you to be able to be more productive. But if input tariffs fall, then inputs are cheaper now. So then that may make you very lax. So it may go the other way. Okay. So typically, trade economists are not only interested in output tariffs, input tariffs, they're interested in, sometimes the net effect of two. So that's called effective rate of protection. You need to convert tariffs into, in some sense, way. This is not an important point, but I have often been asked these questions that, so this is the dilemma. Sometimes you need to do an adjustment, but the data does not exist for that adjustment. Sometimes the data that exists for the adjustment is way back in time. Okay. In India, this is definitely true because data sets are corrected at like 5 to 10 year frequencies, right? This is not a question. You have to do the adjustment. Okay. Even if it's past, do not even think about putting a line in your paper saying, because the data was collected in 1997, I choose not to do this adjustment. It's not going to work. Okay. You have to do the adjustment, right? Because it's very simple. The guy who's reading your paper, he's reading thousands of papers in his career. He has only seen output minus input divided by 1 minus sigma alpha s. If he does not see 1 minus sigma alpha s, you are wrong. The fact that alpha s comes from 1987 or 1982, this is of lesser importance to the person relative to the fact that 1 minus alpha j nahi hai. Okay. So this is something you have to, it's very important for you to take forward. Okay. So like these guys use jahan se mila data wahan se, right. So you just piece together data sets from various places. Again, I want to give those who work on industry and stuff, be a little humble when you work with Provost data set. Provost data set is a very, very selected kind of data set. As you know, it's income and balance sheets of publicly listed companies. It's 70% of the organized sector, but it's not a census. Okay. So disappearance of firms from data does not necessarily mean exit of firms. Often, they just don't report. And so sometimes, what you can do is you can run various methods, right? One of the common problems I see is that whenever you do a method which you think is correct, people don't report other things. So they will have a table which says IB estimates. Okay. When you are reading a paper, you often want to see an OLS, the simple method, the more complicated method, then the more complicated method, because they want to know what is happening. Okay? Because remember, the referee does not have your data set. Okay? So वो उसको पता नहीं तुम क्या करे. He's not believing you to begin with, right? So of course he's giving you credit that you have not fudged the numbers, but you have to show to him exactly what is happening. Okay? And therefore, and sometimes you can use these one against the other. So a common example is when you are running an OLS and an IV, if you get results which look very similar coefficients, but the IV is, so you believe there is an endogeneity because literature says there is an endogeneity. अब इंडिया में है कि नहीं है किसी को नहीं पता. Okay, so now you find your instrument, you run it. Okay, let's say the instrument is will be okay, you can defend it. It's insignificant, but its coefficient is exactly the same thing as OLS. The OLS is significant. Okay, you can, if you are really if you really want to push it, you can push it and say, look, my coefficient looks exactly the same. The point estimate is the same. There is no bias, right? The only reason why you see insignificance for an IV estimator is because IV is an inefficient process. It reduces variation and therefore standard errors go up, right? OLS does not. So you can see that I have a significant coefficient. So it's not that my results are not true, and perhaps there is no bias also, because in this respect you see the coefficients are okay. Okay. Of course, the person will then attack your instruments, but if you can defend your instruments, you can still have a paper. Okay. This typically also happens if you are doing corrections for any non-spherical errors like serial correlation, autocorrelation, doing clustering, so on and so forth. Sometimes basically if you do it without it, you can show that there are results, and then you do it with it and results become insignificant, right? But the coefficient point estimate stays more or less the same. Okay. So your contention then is that, look, your coefficient is the same, the method itself is an inefficient method, right? And that's why you're getting this particular thing. This idea is actually concretized in all the Hausman tests. So every time you look at a test of random effects versus fixed effects, right? This is exactly the logic that is used in this test. In fact, anyone who reports a random effects and a fixed effects has to grade as, does not know enough econometrics, because it makes no difference. The fact is that you should be doing fixed effects. Okay? The only reason you don't do fixed effects is because if you get insignificant things, right? But if your random effects gives you the same answer, but your standard errors are better, then you should be doing random effects, right? The only reason people should do random effects is because random effects is a more efficient procedure. Okay? Now, if your random effects coefficient and your fixed effects coefficient are very different, then random effect galat hai. Then you do not even need to do random effects. Don't give it and say, look, मेरा यहाँ पे 10 आया है, वहाँ पे 25 आया है, and now let's compare. There is no comparison. Right? Fixed effects is better. The only reason to do random effects is if you have insignificant coefficients in a fixed effects regression. Okay. Okay. So the biggest problem in this paper, as in that they have to face, is that the endogeneity, which means that the trade policy correlates with something about the industry, yeah, and that also affects your productivity. So here's an example. So the relatively less efficient industries may have enjoyed higher degree of protection. So if liberalization was not as intensive in the least productive industries, then the small declines in tariff, right, are associated with small increases in productivity. ये तो ऐसी बहुत ही खराब sector है. They have not improved much over time, but on the other hand, they are all protected, so their tariff changes are very small, right? In the industries which are very good, which are dynamic, their tariff rates differences are larger over time, the changes are larger. So then it will look like tariff changes जहाँ पे ज़्यादा है, वहाँ पे ज़्यादा change in productivity है. Okay, tariff rates cause more productivity, right? It's a completely wrong conclusion of that analysis. Everyone clear about this, right? So tariff rate changes are smaller in inefficient industries. Inefficient industries anyways don't show much change in productivity over time. Okay, tariff changes are larger in efficient industries, which anyways show large changes of productivity over time. Okay, so when you see small changes and large changes in tariffs, you also see small changes and large changes in productivity, right? And then you say, well, the large change in productivity is because of tariffs. That's not true. Okay, so you have to take into account that. Okay, so you check, and large part of what you do is basically checking the variation on the main variable of choice. This is why there are, again, I just want to point this out. You know, there are two kinds of papers I see written in India. One on determinants of. Okay, determinants of papers are fine as long as you concede their typologies, means you are describing various things. Okay, but if you are writing a paper which is, you don't want it to be a typology paper, but you want to say make a causal statement, you cannot have a paper which has a causal statement, or you will never end up having a paper which has a causal statement about 4 or 5 different things. Okay, because it's just not the way you can argue a paper. So you have to choose, and this is something that came out when I was talking with some students. You have to decide what is your paper on. The paper is on about one association. Okay, choose your association. What is the interest to you? Okay, so think about an X that matters. Your paper is about that X. Your title will be impact of that X on whatever Y. Okay, you can name it more creatively, but that's basically what the paper is. Okay, all the other variables are there to partial out all the other effects that are there. Okay, that's the way you think about all other variables. Okay, now once you decide that, you have to now start defending the endogeneity of X. It gives you one advantage. As soon as you start putting up something like that, the attention of the reader, of your referee, is on X. Okay, if you have a paper on 4 things, you have opened a war on 4 flanks. You have to defend 4 things. Okay, that's crazy. You cannot, let me tell you. Okay, so always have on one X, everything else is a control. Always put things where all the other controls should be where there is no ambiguity कि ये इसमें कुछ कोई problem है. That's simple thing. You may even drop things which you think may be important for Y, but which you are not sure that they may be endogenous. Just drop them. Don't even think about it. Okay, just on that list there should be no, like if you run a wage regression, schooling is you are looking at Minserian returns. Schooling is your paper. Okay, now father का education, कहाँ income status है, ये है वो है, they are usually non-controversial variables. You put there. Do not put a variable like, you know, कि मेरा भाई भी पढ़ाई करता है कि नहीं. As soon as you put मेरा भाई भी पढ़ाई करता है कि नहीं, immediately your referee will say, oh, but the referee, those are simultaneous choices, because your education decision and your brother's education decision are being made at the same time. Okay, now you may think that your brother's education matters a lot for your human capital outcome, but you are just getting into making your life difficult. Don't have that variable. Anything that you feel, so don't go by R square, because of course as soon as you put your brother's education, R squares will rise, right? No, it's a variable which correlates with things about the households, and household unobservables affect your brother's education as well as your education. Do not have that variable in that. Only have exogenous variables, and your battlefield is X. Okay, and then you have to start defending that you have exogenous variation in X. Okay, so this paper, yeah, in fact you can see it's all stylistic in some sense, right? So देखा ना, X, even formulation is like that in X. ठीक है, X are like other variables that you need to control for. Do not look at them so seriously. Yeah, I am interested in trade. Okay, यहीं पे I have noticed people going like 3 lines. You know, student like this, plus that, plus this and that. You know, your referee doesn't know where to look, and he's looking everywhere. And then he finds something that he feels is not right. Immediately he'll say, इसको पता नहीं है क्या कर रहा है. Okay. Okay. The only reason you don't do fixed effects is because if you get insignificant things, right? But if your random effects gives you the same answer, but your your standard errors are better, then you should be doing random effects, right? The only reason people should do random effects is because random effects is a more efficient procedure. Okay. Now, if your random effects coefficient and your fixed effects coefficient are very different, तब random effect गलत है. Then you do not even need to do random effects. Don't give it and say, look, मेरा यहाँ पे 10 आया है, वहाँ पे 25 आया है, and now let's compare. There is no comparison. Right? Fixed effects is better. The only reason to do random effects is if you have insignificant coefficients in a fixed effects regression. Okay. Okay. So the biggest problem in this paper, as in that they have to face, is that the endogeneity, which means that the trade policy correlates with something about the industry, yeah, and that also affects your productivity. So here's an example. So, the relatively less efficient industries may have enjoyed higher degree of protection. So, if liberalization was not as intensive in the least productive industries, then the small declines in tariff, right, are associated with small increases in productivity. ये तो ऐसी बहुत ही खराब sector है. They have not improved much over time, but on the other hand, they are all protected, so their tariff changes are very small, right. In the industries which are very good, which are dynamic, their tariff rates differences are larger over time, the changes are larger. So then it will look like tariff changes जहाँ पे ज़्यादा है, वहाँ पे ज़्यादा change in productivity है. Okay, tariff rates cause more productivity, right? It's a completely wrong conclusion of that analysis. Everyone clear about this, right? So tariff rate changes are smaller in inefficient industries. Inefficient industries anyways don't show much change in productivity over time. Okay, tariff changes are larger in efficient industries, which anyways show large changes of productivity over time. Okay, so when you see small changes and large changes in tariffs, you also see small changes and large changes in productivity, right? And then you say, well, the large change in productivity is because of tariffs. That's not true. Okay, so you have to take into account that. Okay, so you check, and large part of what you do is basically checking the variation on the main variable of choice. This is why there are, again, I just want to point this out. There are two kinds of papers I see written in India. One on determinants of. Okay, determinants of papers are fine as long as you concede their typologies, means you are describing various things. Okay, but if you are writing a paper which is, you don't want it to be a typology paper, but you want to say make a causal statement, you cannot have a paper which has a causal statement, or you will never end up having a paper which has a causal statement about 4 or 5 different things. Okay, because it's just not the way you can argue a paper. So you have to choose, and this is something that came out when I was talking with some students. You have to decide what is your paper on. The paper is on about one association. Okay, choose your association. What is the interest to you? Okay, so think about an X that matters. Your paper is about that X. Your title will be impact of that X on whatever Y. Okay, you can name it more creatively, but that's basically what the paper is. Okay, all the other variables are there to partial out all other effects that are there. Okay, that's the way you think about all other variables. Okay, now once you decide that, you have to now start defending the endogeneity of X. It gives you one advantage. As soon as you start putting up something like that, the attention of the reader, of your referee, is on X. Okay, if you have a paper on 4 things, you have opened a war on 4 flanks. You have to defend 4 things. Okay, that's crazy. You cannot, let me tell you. Okay, so always have on one X, everything else is a control. Always put things where all the other controls should be where there is no ambiguity कि ये इसमें कुछ कोई problem है. That's simple thing. You may even drop things which you think may be important for Y, but which you are not sure that they may be endogenous. Just drop them. Don't even think about it. Okay, just on that list there should be no, like if you run a wage regression, schooling is you are looking at Minserian returns. Schooling is your paper. Okay, now father का education, कहाँ income status है, ये है वो है, they are usually non-controversial variables. You put there. Do not put a variable like कि मेरा भाई भी पढ़ाई करता है कि नहीं. As soon as you put मेरा भाई पढ़ाई करता है कि नहीं, immediately your referee will say, oh, but the referee, those are simultaneous choices, because your education decision and your brother's education decision are being made at the same time. Okay, now you may think that your brother's education matters a lot for your human capital outcome, but you are just getting into making your life difficult. Don't have that variable. Anything that you feel, so don't go by R square, because of course as soon as you put your brother's education, R squares will rise, right? No, it's a variable which correlates with things about the households, and household unobservables affect your brother's education as well as your education. Do not have that variable in that. Only have exogenous variables, and your battlefield is X. Okay, and then you have to start defending that you have exogenous variation in X. Okay, so this paper, yeah, in fact you can see it's all stylistic in some sense, right? So देखा ना, X. Even formulation is like that in X. Okay? X are like other variables that you need to control for. Do not look at them so seriously. Yeah? I am interested in trade. Okay? Yahi pe I have noticed people going like 3 lines, student like this, plus that, plus this and that. Your referee doesn't know where to look and he's looking everywhere. And then he finds something that he feels is not right, immediately he'll say, isko pata nahi hai kya kar raha hai. Okay? Your variation in X. Okay? So, first contention is that tariff changes correlate with product characteristics, industry characteristics. Okay? So, they analyze tariff changes of 545 products for 1992-96 and 1997 to 2001 reveals that the movements in tariffs were uniform until 1997. Okay? In fact, once they start putting in all the variables for the industries, they find that policymakers were more selective in setting product tariffs during 97-2001, right? As soon as there is this non-uniformity, things which correlate with your variable, immediately just drop. Your research is valid only for 92 to 96. Okay? So, there is a potential endogeneity of trade reforms during this period. This will not be part of your analysis. Okay? I'll come to that later. Not part of analysis. Okay? So, now you might say that, अरे यार सबसे interesting part तो 97 के बाद ही है, उसके बाद आता है TRIPS आता है, ये आता है, वो आता है. But unless you have a strategy, there is no point in extending years just because it's interesting, because in the end you are losing what you can. It's more important to say something correct about something rather than say something incorrect about a more interesting thing. Okay? This is just complete mantra, take it as mantra. Okay? Again, these are all things I have was not taught. I have learned through a lot of rejections in life. Right? It's always the most interesting thing seems to be outside the data period. कि वहाँ पे करूँगा तो you'll see something interesting and you believe it's right. But sometimes strategies are not so sound when you move outside. Okay, so then next thing, that these tariff reforms correlate with industry characteristics. So they use the ASI data. Let me say one quick thing. I feel that these mantras are more useful than the content, because the papers you can always read. The important thing is that in today's day, any paper written, empirical paper written with one data set has a very low probability of being published. Okay? It's very simple. People just want different kinds of information, and everyone now knows what data sets are available in India. The age where you didn't know what's outside your domain is gone. Everyone knows कि ASI है, NSSO है, ये है, वो है. If they know the data exists, they will ask you to merge data and do it. Even though it's a pain, even though it's hard, even though it's a lot of time spent, it's virtually, for example, NSSO, it's virtually impossible to write a very good paper just using NSSO, right? You have to combine it with something else. You write a paper in education using DICE, people will say, asar se dikhao ki ye ho raha hai. Write a paper with asar, people will say, DICE ka data dikhao. And the thing is that it's not a question that it's hard. Hard is not a valid, now reason. If the data sets exist and you can potentially in principle show something, you will have to show it, whether you do it now or someone will ask you to do it. Regress, very simple, regress output tariffs, input tariffs, effective data protection on industry characteristics. You have all that. Result, no statistical correlation. Okay. Again, if it was there, let's say it was there, what would you do? Let's say that there was some correlation in one of these things, what would you do? Let's say there was, as I said, what if the paper is not working out? You need your thesis. What would you do? ये input data, you have like spent all the effort, made it, data compile किया, ये किया, नहीं आ रहा. अब now this is, so they have no statistical correlation, but let's say that you do have statistical correlation with employment in 87, average wage, concentration of industry. What would be the other way out? Obviously your results would not be so strong, but you can still wriggle out a little bit. How? Anyone has a hint? Okay. So what is being used here? The variation that is being used is in some sense temporal in nature, right? You are looking at changes in tariffs. Of course, they are demeaned and stuff like that. So the source of identification here are in some sense time series, right? So what is the threat if those correlate with some initial employment, initial wage rate, concentration of industry? The threat is that based on these initial conditions, each of the industries will have different time trends, right? And those time trends will correlate with the tariff time trends. And so what you are picking up as the impact of tariffs is in fact because of differential growth based on initial employment, based on initial concentration of industry, right? If you wanted to counter that, what would you have to include in the regression? So there is a particular industry जिसमें बहुत कम tariff हुआ है, उसका employment बहुत high था 87 में. You fear that that industry with high employment has now has a time trend which is basically just very similar to the time trend of the tariffs, right? And so you feel that when you see the coefficient of tariff, वो tariff के लिए नहीं है, वो because कि जो industry का employment ज़्यादा था उसका अलग time trend है. So what would you do to counter that view? Yeah, but what kind of time trends? So if you believe that there are time trends with, what would you do? So there are two options, right? One, you can include employment ka time series data, right? That you have data for employment every year, so you throw in employment as a right hand side variable, as a control variable, right? But that has a problem because employment responds to the productivity and so on and so forth. So you don't know which way it's running. Is productivity because of employment or employment because of productivity, right? So you cannot do that. What's the next best thing you can do? Time trend, right? You will allow different time trends for each industry. If you allow that, then basically you are taking into account, you are already parceling out the impact that each of these industries have different time trends. Okay, so notice that when you are, everyone get it? So if you think that low employment industries have different time trend, so take the low employment in 87, that cannot be affected by tariffs, वो तो बहुत tariff के पहले था, right? And now you interact that with time trend. So that means you are allowing for the fact that low employment industries have a different time trend as compared to high employment industries, right? Once you have it in the regressor, its effect is partialed out. If you still have a result, then that is not because of this particular time trend. Okay, so sometimes you can, so these are lucky things that you have no statistical correlation. Anytime you have correlation of the treatment with baseline effects and you are using temporal variation, you always have interaction dummies, interaction variables where you interact the baseline variable with time trends, okay, which kind of partial out the impact of these differential time trends. Okay, you also have to have a story, but let's forget that. Okay, so that's basically on industry characteristics. Now, what's the relationship with industry productivity? Because in the argument that I said there could be a problem, I said, well, low productivity industries have lower changes in tariffs. So, but that we can check, because if you regress all these outputs ERP of T+1 on industry level productivity in period T, and you control for all these other things, then you look at the correlation. If you get no correlation, that's great. So you see correlation between future trade protection and current productivity is insignificant for 89 to 96. That means there is no current productivity does not forecast or predict future trade protection. So it's not that कि जो मेरा अगर कम productivity है तो मेरा tariff change in the future will be lower or higher. So this basically counters that argument, right? But you see correlation is negative and significant for 97 to 2001. Okay, that means this argument is indeed true. sample restricted to 89 to 96. Immediately, there is nothing you can do. Just accept it. Okay. So what I want you to kind of pick up from this is, of course, this has been thought the other way, to be honest, right? They have run this, they have realized that 89 to 96 ये problem hai. They have constructed an argument on why there is a problem, why there could be a problem, and then they have realized that this will not work, no one will accept this, and then they have dropped this, okay, and moved on. Okay. So now what I want you to do is I want you to look at the handouts that has been given to you. In fact, one of you can share. Can you share with him? Version you have. Okay. Lag of output tariff. You see a coefficient across all columns, significant and the same sign. Okay. What's your first impression? पता नहीं क्या क्या किया है. It looks like सब कुछ में answer है. Okay. This is I used to think this is all marketing, but now I've realized that these are like, immediately, because as soon as you get too insignificant and then start getting significance, people will say your result is not robust. Remember, referees are just looking for an excuse to dump you. They are getting thousands of, every journal now has hundreds and hundreds of submissions, right? They are happy to let go. They don't think that you are changing the world. Okay, you may be, but they don't think so. But so they are looking. You do not want to give any sense that you have results that are not robust, especially on your first table. Okay, so that's this for example 4A is one of the main tables of this paper. Okay, the first thing you notice is that it's a negative sign. It's all throughout. It looks more or less significant. For a large amount of value, the point estimates are more or less the same, but that's for later. Okay. Reporting variables. Okay. You notice that these industry fixed effects, firm fixed effects, these are different styles of doing it, but do not give all your results on one table. I see people like give pura paper with all the covariates. Okay. Again, it has to do with this attitude that you have, this determinants kind of model. In a determinants paper, it's fine to give everything, but you want to look at everything. In a paper that is about causality, do not do that. Okay. Always give the coefficient of the main thing with basically saying like this, that you have control for these things. Of course, in an appendix, one table should be the full results, so that people don't think that you are hiding. So the results are there for you to see, but you are looking at it, and for you, you can see clearly that this is the effect that you want to see. Okay. Estimates of beta are negative and significant. So of course, reduction of tariff lead to an increase in TFP because negative sign. But then reallocation of market share towards more productive firms. This is a limitation of prowess because there are these exit and entries which you really cannot measure properly from prowess. So here's another way to say that, look, maybe entry and exit are not big deal. Okay. So remember what the argument is. Prowess we know is a data set which is kind of not so good measuring entry exit, right? शायद exit नहीं होता है, पर it's not very clear. कि maybe exit होता है, prowess doesn't get it. So what's the idea here? Idea here is that this is not being given just कि ले लो, ये भी ले लो, ऐसा नहीं है. This is being given to make an argument. The argument is, if I were to take only a balanced set of firms which always remain, right, which is one of these panels here, 4, right, and the coefficient is minus 0.059, otherwise the other ones are similarly 0.053. So it doesn't seem that it is such a big deal that it will overturn your result altogether. Okay. Now balance mein kya hai, there is no problem of entry exit, but it's only for a particular kind of it's for the sample of firms that survive all throughout. The idea is that, well, even if I don't take into account the firms that exit, I am getting coefficients which are very close. So it may be that this is not a big deal for my problem. Okay. Direct approach, put trade variable in production function. Someone will say, look, so again you see lagged variable AB1, AB2, so that's Ariano bond 1, which is basically with 1 lag, Ariano bond 2, which is with 2 lags, lag dependent variable just without any instrumentation. Direct approaches in the LP problem, in the structural problem we wrote, right, where we said production function depends on K, L, you can put tariffs in directly. Yes, why first calculate tariffs, first calculate productivity and then run all this. Think that the firm output depends on K, L, M, and the input prices are dependent on tariffs, and you can solve the whole problem again and you can estimate it directly. And so that's the last answer, which is basically that the result still says negative. Okay. So the answer is 10% reduction in output tariffs raise firm TFP by 0.53. So essentially 3 is the main specification. Okay. This is also a very important thing. You know, in the main table, when you write down your results, while you make an argument, it should be very clear what is your main specification. Why it's important is because when you fight the war thereafter to show how robust your results are, you should take your main specification and then subject it to all these other tests. Okay? It gives you an advantage also, in the sense that if you have to defend 4 columns of results, when you do different things may happen in different columns. Nah? That's like it will raise your what you have to do a lot. It's just easier for you to defend one specification, you stand by it, that is your final specification. Okay? If someone else finds a different answer in some other specification, you say it's not my fault. Main specification 3A. Okay? And I will do that. Okay. So that's the result. Okay? Now that's the output, input, table 4B and 5. 5 is ERP. You see a 10% reduction in ERP leads to a 0.25% increase in TFP. The coefficient of input tariffs is a much larger and higher than the output tariffs. You can see that that was 0.53%. This is this one. Yeah, sorry. This was 0.53 and I moved somewhere else. 10% is 0.53. This is ERP and this one must be much larger, 4 point something. 5B, 4B, output tariffs effective. Yeah. 0.32, a 10% point decline in input tariffs is a 4.8 percentage point. So the input tariff is a much bigger deal than output tariffs. Okay. I think you can see it. 4B is ERP, yeah. Okay. Right. So 10% increase is 0.3 for output tariff and it's 4.8 for input tariff. Okay. So it's comparative. So this suggests that the main route of improvement is through a wider choice of inputs and perhaps the embodied technology that comes with it. Okay. Notice that it's not, in fact, it's not going to go down this path anymore. I'm going to make that comment and move on. Why? Because the impact, ultimately this paper is about the impact of tariffs and productivity. This is an interesting result which will give rise to another paper. So when people think about chapter 2 or chapter 3, you know, do not think that you can stuff in a lot in one chapter, okay? Because once you change the focus, it will require different kind of things, right? And you will see, I have actually deliberately put 2 papers here because you can see how one work will lead to the other work. This is just the recognition that the effect is much larger on input tariffs. Having said that, it moves on. Okay. Okay. So now the question is, you know, firm characteristics. So now you have to show that these results are not like, you know, when you run regression, koi result aa gaya. So now it's consistent with some ideas that you have about the industries, right? So here's, if you see domestic industries, so that's the table 5 other columns, I think. You can see private group firm, government owned, for firm sizes, which is on, wait, I'm just struggling with this. Okay, so table 7 basically is giving you the difference between domestic firms and foreign firms, you can see the domestic firms are the ones that gain in productivity on table 7. Large, medium, small, you can see that there are no differential impacts for firm size. Be wary of one thing though, whenever you are looking at signs across columns, point estimates are very, very hard to interpret, right? You can have two ways. So here's a very interesting thing. You can have one coefficient that is insignificant, another coefficient which is significant positive, but it does not mean that one coefficient is different from the other. Okay? So for example, you can get foreign is 0.041, domestic is negative 0.062, right? You can say so domestic is less than, the effect is more than that of foreign. That's not true. Why is that not true? Huh? Typically the problem is, this is some standard problem that people face in papers. When they want to show heterogeneity by two factors, they show two columns. One is significant and the other is not, right? So you've just written, it does not have an effect on this, it has an effect on this, then it's just like think about gender. You're writing something on gender, it has effect on boys, it has no effect on girls. Therefore, effect of boys is more than the girls. The third statement does not follow. Okay? That's a statistical truth. Because the problem is, when you get insignificance for girls, say, then that means it has a very high standard error. It varies a lot, right? When you do a hypothesis test on whether the coefficient for boys is different from the coefficient from girls, you will have to face the fact that the girls' coefficient it varies a lot. So statistical tests may tell you that there is no statistical difference between the coefficient of the boys and the girls, right? Even though the statement that there is a positive effect for boys and no effect for girls is equally true. Okay? So this is kind of an important thing, and I have seen many people get a little angry when they see people making comparisons across columns which are not tested using some sort of hypothesis test.
That essentially means that different kinds of statistical tests has to be done to check for differences.
Yeah. So either that, or you have the main specification where you interact the variable with these different dummies. So you have so let's say you want to check if domestic firms are different from foreign. You have a variable called domestic, and then the tariffs will be interacted with the domestic, and if they are differential to the foreign, that is a statistical test that they are different, right? But often in heterogeneity we don't do that. We run them by each of them kind, for these kind of household, for this kind of industry, for this, and then we see significance and no significance, and then we kind of like to jump to conclusions that one is more than the other. That's not true. You have to do a hypothesis testing. It's simple. You can use a simple test, t-test, but you still have to do it. Okay. So there is no different across sizes. In fact, somewhere in the paper it also says that we do statistical tests to check whether these statements are in fact true or false. So just don't go by just the coefficient. Okay. Now, then comes a huge barrage of people who work on industry, right? They will say, "Arey, tum trade theorist ho, tum bhi aisa trade weight kar rahe ho." But the world is not just trade. There's also industrial policy that's happening at the same time, right? So if so the argument on all these things is a little subtle, right? So in the sense that it's true that a lot of things happen in India at the same time, okay? And it's true that domestic policy also has a lot of impacts on productivity. But remember that you are not trying to predict what is happening to productivity. Your question is whether tariff changes correlate with productivity or not, right? So other policies like domestic industrial policies are only important and difficult to confound your analysis only if they also correlate with these tariff changes, right? By itself, the fact that domestic, people can say, trade is a very small part of what happens in Indian industry. Industrial policy is much more important, right? That's fine. You can write a paper on industrial policy. No one's stopping you, right? But for my result, that tariffs correlate with productivity. The only threat from this industrial policy is if reductions in output tariffs across industries over time is correlated with various industrial policies that are happening at the same time. Okay. This is true for almost every development work, because government is not doing, so NREG has changed, but NREG, many things happened, roads were built, schools were built, this were built, that was, all happened, right. So the question is, those are threats to your main X only if they correlate at the same time in the same pattern with which your X correlates, right. So now you see why it's so important to fix the X, because without fixing the X you cannot make these arguments, right. So this one shows that so let's see where this is done. So domestic industrial policy is table 9, right, and essentially what they find is that if you see lagged licensing, lagged FDI, right, you can see that like for example lagged licensing, it has a significant coefficient. So it's not that it's not important, right, but your results on lagged tariff, which is your main results, basically survive in spite of controlling for that. Okay. So the effect of trade liberalization is still present. Another trick that's used, okay, is sometimes you have a bunch of other variables which can move at the same time, but which are themselves endogenous, right. So think about, you know, a particular sarpanch has some policy, you want to look at the impact of that policy on some outcome, right. But the sarpanch does not do only one policy, sarpanch may do something else also, right. So the question is, you know, but your paper is only about that one policy, right. So you still want to focus on that policy. One trick that you have, that you can do is, once you have the main results with this one policy, you can create a robustness table which shows that even if you throw some sort of an indication on the other policy, your results, your coefficients do not change that much, right. So typically people don't even report coefficients of this variable they throw in, because this variable, it's a bit like that example that I gave you about you know, your brother's education, right. Now it's endogenous, but if everyone feels that, you know, your results are being driven by your brother's education, so you have got your main results don't have brother's education. Robustness, you say that, well, I have this result, you may say that everything is being driven by the brother's education, I know it's endogenous, I am going to throw it in the main specification and show you that my result is equally true, it does not change, okay. In fact, you should not even give the coefficient of this variable, because this variable, that you are not pretending that it is a correct thing. All you are saying is that if you are telling me that my results are coming because of this, I am plugging that, my results don't change, okay. But this shall only come much later in a robustness section, which shows that your results are invariant to all the other objections that people may face, may raise regarding your result, okay. So don't put it in table 1 or table 2, whatever your main table is, because there your paper is gone, you cannot survive. Okay. Now I mean, there are other results too which you can look in the paper, but I just wanted to show you this reporting thing. Another thing that again, these are another important thing. If you choose a particular format for reporting results on your main table, please keep the same format in every table, okay. Do not change it, because once you start reading a paper, you start getting used to an argument, the way you argue, the way you move across your columns. If you suddenly change something, then, you know, suddenly the guy will, you know, sometimes you look at referee comments and you say that, अरे ये तो लिखा हुआ है पेपर में, नहीं क्यों नहीं देखा? Again, referees have no time. Once they have understood your top table, then they just move, and then they are looking at the results. Sometimes they are not even reading what you are, they are just acha acha, because they have their own understanding on how they would write the paper, right. They are looking at it. If you change sequence of those things, you know, he will just completely, he will get confused and then he'll say, yaar, you know, pata nahi kya kiya hai. That's, you never want the referee to say that, okay. Okay, so how to move to chapter 2, right. So you have a result, you've got it, you've shown something, this is all you wanted to say, that tariffs have an impact on productivity, right. But in doing so, you got an interesting result that you know, that impact of input tariffs was much larger than impact of output tariffs, right, which told you that the impact must be on the side of the inputs. Take it, you see Topolova again back, So now you have more queries. Now you go deeper in another direction, right? So this is basically says that, so if inputs are cheaper, the access to new imported inputs, does it enable firms to expand domestic product scope, right? Does it imply that they can produce much more? The introduction of new varieties. This will generate gains from anyone who's done trade. You know that as soon as you have new varieties, you can get gains from trade. Okay. So of course, you know, you deal with this potential reverse causality that firms may decide to introduce new products for reasons unrelated to international trade. For these new products, they may demand imported inputs, existing as well as new varieties. So the correlation is just the opposite, right? And you know, the growth of products may then increase the demand for imported inputs and not the other way. Okay, so you set it up immediately. You have written paper 1. You have identification that trade reforms were unexpected. You've already laid all the hard work. Okay, so input tariffs reduced differentially across sectors, same variation, right? You can use exactly the same variation to answer another question which is completely consistent with the paper you have before. Okay. Now, what does theory tell you about what the effects is? Well, lowering of input tariffs on existing inputs raises profit and makes some goods that are unprofitable earlier profitable. As I said, import of new input varieties expand the set of inputs available to you, but it's not obvious that this will have an effect. It depends on the substitutability of existing domestic inputs and new inputs. Can you just replace your inputs by the domestic ones? So this is called the extensive margin effect, and that's called the pure price effect. Okay, and you know, to be able to separate them out, you can never separate them out with empirical work, because empirical work you'll never be able to figure out which one is coming from where. Okay, this is where you will need some theory more than just looking at input tariff changes that to separate these two things out. Okay, now in this literature, this separation is an important part of the effect of trade. Okay, so this has to be acknowledged. Now, in contrast to a lot of work that happens in development economics, when you work on trade and industry, it's fairly standard to resort to theory to be able to do subsequent empirical work, right? So the way development works is that you get an empirical result, those are facts, then there must be some model that basically says this is right. Okay. In trade, in IO, in industry, the way it works is you have some empirical results, but sometimes to move forward in being able to explain the results or to disaggregate and show you what the mechanisms are, the theory is actively invoked, and it's acceptable that you do that. Okay. This is very important because sometimes you cannot move forward without the theory. The theory will guide what the next empirical regression should be. Okay. It's very simple. In development, you can run multiple experiments to get every mechanism. In things like trade, macro, you cannot. So at some point, you have to go via theory. Okay. So what does the raw data tell us? You can see that real imports grew by 130%, intermediate inputs went up by 227%, final products only grew by 90%. So I mean, it's obvious again, the first thing that, the first correlation that there is a big increase in product variety. Sorry? Okay, noise. So basically this is the result, that extensive margin contributed only 37%. Okay. So first, reduced form. Reduced form means यहाँ पे कोई invoke नहीं किया theory, पहले pattern. This is just pattern. Instead of drawing the graph, you draw a regression. This is not supposed to tell you what is actually happening, but supposed to tell you that this is, you know, the advantage of running a reduced form sometimes is that it gives you the standard errors. If you were to just draw it on a graph, it would have no standard errors, so you would not be sure whether the results you are showing, these point estimates, how accurate they are, and you know, maybe you are making something out of it, but actually it's insignificant. The regression is just same, it's nothing but a trend, it's just telling you the correlation between the number of imported varieties in a category H with basically the tariff rates, detrending and taking into account, you know, fixed effects, just like the other paper, right? So this you expect that this will, you know, be in your direction. So significant and negative beta is some evidence that this hypothesis is plausible. However, when H is the group of intermediate products, then the coefficient is twice as large as when you look at final product. Okay? All this is description. Okay? You have got the tariff, which you know from the other paper. To some extent, it's exogenous, right? Now you first show some basic results. So people may be very complicated about price effect and this effect and that effect. सब बात की बात. पहले दिखाओ कि कुछ हो रहा है कि नहीं जो बोल रहे हो. Okay? Similarly, some reduced form evidence on product scope. Again, simple regression, significant and negative beta, sign remains even after you control for FDI, licensing, output price and all that stuff. The best papers are always written with the first few tables with very few regressors, controls. It basically means that your exogenous variation is so strong that you really don't need to control for that many covariates. Okay? This is why it's recommended by me that you do not put, even if your results work out with a lot of covariates, do not put all the covariates on the main result table in the main text, because it gives this impression to people that if you did not have one of these things, तुम्हारा result नहीं है. Okay? So when you write down like just the result of X and then say everything taken into account, it gives you this visual kind of thing that your results look very strong. You control for some things, but it looks strong, right? RCT people love this because their designs are like that you don't need to control for anything. Just put like the treatment dummy, treatment into time, difference in difference, you get results. बाकी की बात है कि control करो कि नहीं करो, you get a little bit different. So people, it's like we don't want all this complicated stuff because the result works out perfectly. Okay, but it's true that many descriptive, papers which don't have such a strong causal framework often work out only after you control for some covariates. So it's good visually not to show every covariate that you have out there. Okay. So as I said, it's the same kind of problem, but now since the Y's are different, so you have to think about, you argue differently. Identification requires there are no existing pre-reform trends in, तो वहाँ में productivity था, this is a paper on number of products, so you have to show that there is no pre-reform trends in the number of products that systematically correlate with input and changes in prices, right? You could have said ये सब तो वहीं पे कर देना चाहिए था, right? But that's a JDE and this is a QJE. So you can subsequently move further and further. You have to know where to stop. Sometimes we just put too much in one paper. It doesn't convince anyone. You don't get any brownie points for putting everything in one paper. Okay, you just confuse sometimes the guy who's refereeing. Okay, so now you see there is some ghapla here. Why? Result thoda lag gaya hai, right? So in the other paper what happened, whenever you put input tariffs on all these things, you basically got them to be statistically insignificant, right? Which meant that you could just say the matter nahi karta hai, right? So now there is something going on, right? Because now you control by introducing pre-reform industry growth rates in number of products. Okay, entry exit are there. You look at one specification, comparing it with another specification, no great change in coefficients. So you see the argument is that when you are a little bit not on such strong grounds, you have to show various different kind of specifications with different accounting for different things and hope that your coefficients don't change. If they don't, that means that problem is not really significant. The problem may be there, so you cannot show that the problem is not there. Your argument then is that the problem is there, but it seems that as I am changing my specification depending on, take balanced, unbalanced, I put some lag growth rate in my regression, I put something else in my regression, results are not changing that much. Okay, so so this is the part that I don't know if I should do this. What's the time? No, okay. So I'll just tell you about it so that you can look at it. It's in the first lecture. So let me just tell you that what is the purpose of the paper. The purpose of the paper you just saw. I have only shown you that they take the input and output prices, and they've noticed that the impact of input tariffs is larger. And in the first two tables in description, they've shown you that the number of the scope of products and the number of input varieties rises with input tariffs, right? But what they want to do is they want to separate out how much of it is coming because the inputs are cheaper, and how much of it is coming because there are a larger set of inputs that you can choose from. Okay? And so if you do some basic trade theory, then you can come up with an index which basically divides the price, the input bundle and price changes into two parts. One part basically is a pure price effect which comes from this expression here, right, this expression here, and one part comes from this gamma here, which is basically due to new varieties of products that come up. Okay? So please look at the notes. I mean, I derive all this in the previous lecture where you can see how these things are defined, right? But it's pure, let me show you even if I don't do it, right, which told you that the impact must be on the side of the inputs. Take it, you see Topolova, again back, right? So now we have more queries. Now you go deeper in another direction, right? So this is basically says that, so if inputs are cheaper, the access to new imported inputs, does it enable firms to expand domestic product scope, right? Does it imply that they can produce much more? The introduction of new varieties. This will generate gains from anyone who's done trade. You know that as soon as you have new varieties, you can get gains from trade. Okay. So of course, you deal with this potential reverse causality that firms may decide to introduce new products for reasons unrelated to international trade. For these new products, they may demand imported inputs, existing as well as new varieties. So the correlation is just the opposite, right? And the growth of products may then increase the demand for imported inputs and not the other way. Okay, so you set it up immediately. You have written paper 1. You have identification that trade reforms were unexpected. You've already laid all the hard work. Okay, so input tariffs reduced differentially across sectors, same variation, right? You can use exactly the same variation to answer another question which is completely consistent with the paper you have before. Okay. Now, what does theory tell you about what the effects is? Well, lowering of input tariffs on existing inputs raises profit and makes some goods that are unprofitable earlier profitable. As I said, import of new input varieties expand the set of inputs available to you, but it's not obvious that this will have an effect. It depends on the substitutability of existing domestic inputs and new inputs. Can you just replace your inputs by the domestic ones? So this is called the extensive margin effect, and that's called the pure price effect. Okay, and to be able to separate them out, you can never separate them out with empirical work, because empirical work you'll never be able to figure out which one is coming from where. Okay, this is where you will need some theory more than just looking at input tariff changes to separate these two things out. Okay. Now, in this literature, this separation is an important part of the effect of trade. Okay. So this has to be acknowledged. Now, in contrast to a lot of work that happens in development economics, when you work on trade and industry, it's fairly standard to resort to theory to be able to do subsequent empirical work, right? So the way development works is that you get an empirical result, those are facts, then there must be some model that basically says this is right. Okay. In trade, in IO, in industry, the way it works is you have some empirical results, but sometimes to move forward in being able to explain the results or to disaggregate and show you what the mechanisms are, the theory is actively invoked, and it's acceptable that you do that. Okay. This is very important because sometimes you cannot move forward without the theory. The theory will guide what the next empirical regression should be. Okay. It's very simple. In development, you can run multiple experiments to get every mechanism. In things like trade, macro, you cannot. So at some point, you have to go via theory. Okay. So what does the raw data tell us? You can see that real imports grew by 130%, intermediate inputs went up by 227%, final products only grew by 90%. So I mean, it's obvious again, the first correlation that there is a big increase in product variety. Sorry? Okay, noise. So So basically this is the result, that extensive margin contributed only 37%. Okay. So first, reduced form. Reduced form means यहाँ पे कोई invoke नहीं किया theory, पहले pattern. This is just pattern. Instead of drawing the graph, you draw a regression. This is not supposed to tell you what is actually happening, but supposed to tell you that this is, the advantage of running a reduced form sometimes is that it gives you the standard errors. If you were to just draw it on a graph, it would have no standard errors, so you would not be sure whether the results you are showing, these point estimates, how accurate they are, and maybe you are making something out of it, but actually it's insignificant. The regression is just same, it's nothing but a trend, it's just telling you the correlation between the number of imported varieties in a category H with basically the tariff rates detrending and taking into account fixed effects, just like the other paper, right? So this you expect that this will be in your direction. So significant and negative beta is some evidence that this hypothesis is plausible. However, when H is the group of intermediate products, then the coefficient is twice as large as when you look at final product. Okay, all this is description. Okay, you have got a tariff which you can from the other paper. To some extent, it's exogenous, right? Now you first show some basic results. So your paper may be very complicated about price effect and this effect and that effect. सब बात की बात. पहले दिखाओ कि कुछ हो रहा है कि नहीं जो बोल रहे हो. Okay. Similarly, some reduced form evidence on product scope. Again, simple regression, significant and negative beta sign remains even after you control for FDI, licensing, output price, and all that stuff. The best papers are always written with the first few tables with very few regressors. Controls. It basically means that your exogenous variation is so strong that you really don't need to control for that many covariates. Okay, this is why it's recommended by me that you do not put, even if your results work out with a lot of covariates, do not put all the covariates on the main result table in the main text, because it gives this impression to people that if you did not have one of these things, तुम्हारा result नहीं है. Okay, so when you write down like just the result of X and then say everything taken into account, it gives you this visual kind of thing that your results look very strong. You control for some things, but it looks strong, right? RCT people love this because their designs are like that you don't need to control for anything. Just put like the treatment dummy, treatment into time, difference in difference, you get results. बाकी की बात है कि control करो कि नहीं करो, you get a little bit different. So people, it's like we don't want all this complicated stuff because the result works out perfectly. Okay, but it's true that many descriptive, papers which don't have such a strong causal framework often work out only after you control for some covariates. So it's good visually not to show every covariate that you have out there. Okay. So as I said, it's the same kind of problem, but now since the y's are different, so you have to think about, you argue differently. Identification requires there are no existing pre-reform trends in, तो वहाँ में productivity था, this is a paper on number of products, so you have to show that there is no pre-reform trends in the number of products that systematically correlate with input and changes in prices, right? You could have said ये सब तो वहीं पे कर देना चाहिए था, right? But that's a JDE and this is a QJE. So you can subsequently move further and further. You have to know where to stop. Sometimes we just put too much in one paper. It doesn't convince anyone. You don't get any brownie points for putting everything in one paper. Okay, you just confuse sometimes the guy who's refereeing. Okay, so now you see there is some ghapla here. Why? Result thoda lag gaya hai, right? So in the other paper what happened, whenever you put input tariffs on all these things, you basically got them to be statistically insignificant, right? Which meant that you could just say, the matter nahi karta hai, right? So now there is something going on, right? Because now you control by introducing pre-reform industry growth rates in number of products, okay? Entry exit are there, you look at one specification comparing it with another specification, no great change in coefficients. So you see the argument is that when you are a little bit not on such strong grounds, you have to show various different kind of specifications with different kind of accounting for different things and hope that your coefficients don't change. If they don't, that means that problem is not really significant. The problem may be there, so you cannot show that the problem is not there. Your argument then is that the problem is there, but it seems that as I am changing my specification depending on, you take balanced, unbalanced, you know, I put some lag growth rate in my regression, I put something else in my regression, results are not changing that much. Okay. So, so this is the part that I don't know if I should do this. What's the time? No, okay. So I'll just tell you about it so that you can look at it. It's in the first lecture. So let me just tell you that what is the purpose of the paper. The purpose of the paper you just saw. I have only shown you that, you know, they take the input and output prices, and they've noticed that the impact of input tariffs is larger. And in the first two tables in description, they've shown you that the number of the scope of products and the number of input varieties rises with input tariffs, right? But what they want to do is they want to separate out how much of it is coming because the inputs are cheaper, and how much of it is coming because there are a larger set of inputs that you can choose from. Okay? And so if you do some basic trade theory, then you can come up with an index which basically divides the price, you know, the input bundle and price changes into two parts. One part basically is a pure price effect which comes from, you know, this expression here, right, this expression here, and one part comes from, you know, this gamma here, which is basically due to new varieties of products that come up. Okay? So please look at the notes. I mean, I derive all this in the previous lecture where you can see how these things are defined, right? But it's pure. Let me show you, even if I don't do it. Okay. It comes from a specification of a Cobb-Douglas production function with labor, with other non-traded inputs, and X's, which are the input various varieties, which are domestic as well as foreign. Okay? If you have ever seen the Grossman book, Helpman book, you will see that every model of trade is basically uses the same structure. Okay? They have these, you know, multiplication of all the product varieties, but Xi is some sort of an index of X, which is the domestic input and the foreign input. Okay? Gives rise to a minimum cost for producing 1 unit of output. So that nice form gives rise to some nice expressions, and using that they come up with a price index which has two parts to it, which is one, a pure price effect. This is basically what happens to foreign inputs as the price drops, and a second part which is called a variety index. So it measures the expenditures of varieties that are available in both periods relative to the expenditures and varieties that are available in the current period, right, after tariff, after decentralization, after liberalization. Okay? So you can see that the more important the new varieties are, the lower this particular thing, because of course now the expenditure on varieties that are available in the current period will be larger than the expenditures that are on varieties that are there in both periods, right. The varieties that are available in both periods are period before reform and period after reform. So they have large number of domestic kind of large number of inputs that were existing earlier. So of course the more substitutable the varieties, the lower the difference between the exact and conventional. So this number, if the new varieties expenditure, so the amount of money you spend in the reform on new varieties of imports is much more, then this number will be less than 1, right, because you spend more than what you spend on varieties you were producing in or using up in both periods. So this is the pure price effect. So the total effect will be less than the conventional price effect if you spend more money in as a firm in buying varieties that are available in the current period relative to what was in both periods. Okay? So there are some things that were there before, and you are using some of them still now, some of them, and then you are using some of what you used earlier and some new things, right. So the total expenditure on the new things is lot more than on these pre-existing varieties. Then basically you don't get a pure price effect, because now your price index takes into account the fact that it's not that the existing varieties are getting cheaper. There are new varieties that are coming in and you're spending more money on them, right? So that's good also because you're getting access to more varieties when you actually produce. Okay? So that's just a simple thing that comes from the theory. Okay? And once that comes, you can take that into the cost function, substitute, and that gives rise to a particular expression, which you then take to the next part of the paper. Essentially, ultimately, you're running a regression on the number of new varieties on this conventional price index, this particular gamma, which is nothing but the ratio of expenditures on varieties in both periods that exist in both periods divided by varieties that are only in this period, and epsilon. And now you have an interpretation of both these things, right? This is the price effect that comes from lowering of prices of inputs. That is the effect that comes from larger number of varieties of inputs that are available in after trade. Okay? Notice this is semi-structural in the sense that you could not have got this expression, these two things, had you not had the theoretical model. The theoretical model gives you these indices, and in trade all these indices are actually derived from theory. Right? They take the theory very seriously. Okay? They don't believe it's just for motivation. They actually do it. So, you know, those who do trade all know this already. Many of the things that we use, many indices we use, you know, they all come from theoretical models. Even IO, Lerner's index, Herfindahl index, they're not arbitrary indices. They come from a deeper model of firm pricing, right? You can map each of these indices to some model that has generated it. Okay? So it's the same with trade. So you cannot get away from that, and ultimately the regressions may not be so complicated, right? So recall that this is decreasing in newer varieties. So theory would predict that beta 1 is negative, so as the price of imports will fall, you know, number of varieties of products will rise, and similarly with that particular variety index. Okay? Then there will be more problems. So that's simple because you did the theory, you got a simple regression. Regression is not complicated at all. You got some coefficients. Then there are various kinds of other problems where you think that epsilon contains other things that the firm has done, what it does in the domestic market, expansion of domestic varieties, so on and so forth. More assumptions on what is, you know, how to solve the problem. So those who know instrumentation, they try to instrument this particular variable. So it goes on. So it's endogenous variable, right? You have two so both these variables are endogenous. They have to be instrumented, and they find instrument. I'm not going to talk about the instruments because this is very specific. Okay? One important thing, those who do trade in IO, is that if you start with a theoretical model and you suddenly get two nice things that work out, which give you a nice regression, you cannot now, after coming all the way, say that theory is not important, right? So the problem is that once you get these two, the theory also predicts what should go in this epsilon f, right? And they will all have to do, so these are all about imports, they will have to do with domestic varieties, what you do in domestic markets, and so on and so forth. So automatically almost, you don't even need a, you know, an argument which is like, you know, ki ye hona chahiye, nahi hona chahiye. If you go by the theory, epsilon f should have all the other terms which are there in your model, and they all correlate with these two things. So even the argument that, you know, I don't think they are correlated, that will not work, because after all you have got these expressions from the theory. Once you have got these expressions from the theory, there are some expressions that have been shoved into epsilon f, right? This is epsilon f is not just now ki those omitted things that we cannot measure. Now epsilon f has a lot of these terms. In fact, all these terms are there in epsilon f. Okay? So these all correlate with these two things. So you will have to then take the theory very seriously, right? So this is an important part of doing work on trade and industry, that you can use theory to motivate specifications, and sometimes they will give you exactly what kind of indices to take to be able to test theories, right? But when you do that, the epsilons will now, it will not be like doing development economics where epsilon में कुछ भी हो सकता है, and you can kind of make stories and stuff. There are no stories there. The epsilon actually has things from the model. People can show you from the model what is there in epsilon, right? And if you don't take care of the endogeneity that gives you, you have a non-starter in a paper. Okay, so to end, it takes a fair deal of time to write papers. Okay, it's possible that if you wanted to publish this second paper, you could have still done it with the input, the product scope, and the first two results, right? But notice that if you had written the first paper, the referee would have gotten back to you saying, but what is then new in the second paper? Because उसमें तो तुमने बस दो चीज extra किया है. Because tariff तो you have already contended is exogenous. Now you have just basically put two more things, right? So that doesn't make a paper. That's not enough additional contribution as compared to your earlier paper. In fact, if you write a good first paper, they will be aware of that, and they will point out that you have, when you are reading a thesis, then it's even more clear. Because of course you are reading chapter 1, then chapter 2 mein you are copying and pasting all the information on the tariffs and everything, and then you are writing basically, now there are two more things that I put in. So whenever you get an extension, you have to then work harder to be able to say that you are doing something slightly different and something more. Okay, something that was not obvious from chapter 1, and it's enough that you cannot put it into chapter 1, because otherwise chapter 1 will become very large. Okay, people are sensitive to the fact that too long a paper is not a good idea. People get tired, like you guys are now already zoning out, kab band karenge baat karna. So it's the same when I'm reading your thesis also, or reading your papers. I'm like, when will it stop? It's okay, I've got your idea. Tariff exogenous hai, acha theek hai, right? So it's the same. Believe me, people do get tired. So with that in mind, I think that's kind of finishes this session. Again, I have chosen to do the more kind of methodological part, because the trade part I think Veeramani will cover. So please feel free to ask him as many questions based on these presentations that you feel. Okay, thanks.